What if I told you that in the year 1437, witnesses at the Battle of Ravenshollow reported seeing the impossible? Two identical knights, bearing the same coat of arms, wielding the same ancestral sword, fighting each other to the death while an entire army watched in frozen terror. Both claimed to be Sir Edmund Blackthorne, the legendary knight who had died in that very same field exactly 7 years earlier. This is the story of a warrior so consumed by hatred and regret that death itself couldn't contain his fury. A tale that medieval chroniclers buried so deep that it took me 3 years to uncover the truth hidden in monastery archives across Europe. Tonight, you'll discover why the church ordered every record of Sir Edmund Blackthorne to be destroyed, and why the village of Ravenshollow was abandoned overnight, never to be inhabited again. The story begins not with Sir Edmund's death, but with his life, and a betrayal so profound it would tear a hole between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Sir Edmund Blackthorne was born into nobility in 1398, the third son of Lord William Blackthorne, a man whose cruelty was legendary even in an age of casual violence. Edmund's childhood was marked by constant humiliation at his father's hands, while his older brothers inherited lands and titles. Edmund was given nothing but scars and a burning hatred that would follow him beyond the grave. At the age of 16, Edmund witnessed his father murder his mother during a drunken rage, claiming she had been unfaithful. The young knight watched from the shadows as Lord William strangled Lady Catherine with his bare hands, her desperate gasps echoing through the castle halls. That night, Edmund made a pact that would damn his soul for eternity. He would have his revenge, no matter the cost. Edmund spent the next 14 years honing his skills as a warrior, but more importantly, delving into forbidden knowledge. He sought out witches, heretics, and practitioners of dark arts, learning secrets that the church would kill to suppress. He discovered ancient rituals that could bind a soul to a specific purpose, preventing it from finding peace even in death. In 1429, Edmund finally enacted his revenge. He challenged his father to single combat, a challenge that couldn't be refused without bringing shame upon the Blackthorne name. The duel took place at dawn in the courtyard of Blackthorne Castle, witnessed by the entire household. But Edmund didn't simply kill his father. Using knowledge gleaned from years of studying dark magic, he performed a ritual during the fight itself, speaking words in a language older than Latin while their swords clashed. Witnesses later reported that Lord William's screams continued long after his body had stopped moving, as if his soul was being torn from his flesh while he still lived. Edmund had bound his father's spirit to eternal torment, but the ritual required a terrible price. To ensure the dark magic would hold, Edmund had to sacrifice his own chance at peaceful death. His soul would be forever tied to unfinished business, unable to rest until every wrong had been avenged for 8 years. Edmund lived with this curse, unaware of its full implications. He became a knight-errant, traveling from battlefield to battlefield, his skill with a sword becoming the stuff of legend. His armor bore a distinctive black rose on a silver field, and his sword, forged from meteoric iron and blessed by a heretical priest, could cut through steel as if it were parchment. But Edmund's greatest enemy wasn't on any battlefield. It was his own younger brother, Thomas, who had inherited their father's lands and, unfortunately, his father's cruel nature. Thomas had discovered evidence of Edmund's involvement in their father's death and was systematically destroying everything Edmund held dear. He had Edmund's name struck from family records, claimed his inheritance, and worst of all, married Lady Isabel de Montfort, the only woman Edmund had ever loved. The final insult came in 1436, when Thomas publicly declared Edmund a kinslayer and a practitioner of witchcraft, effectively placing a death warrant on his head. Edmund's response was swift and terrible. He challenged Thomas to meet him at Ravenshollow Field, the site of an ancient pagan burial ground, where they would settle their differences once and for all. The battle was set for the feast day of St. Michael, September 29th, 1407. Edmund arrived at dawn, his black armor gleaming like oil in the morning light. Thomas came with an army of 200 men, having no intention of fighting a fair duel. He planned to have Edmund surrounded and cut down like a rabid dog. But Edmund had prepared for this betrayal. As the sun reached its zenith, he began the same ritual he had used to damn his father's soul. The ancient words spilled from his lips as Thomas's men closed in around him. The air itself seemed to thicken, and witnesses reported that the very ground began to bleed. Edmund fought like a man possessed, which, in many ways, he was. His sword carved through armor and bone with supernatural ease. He killed 17 men before Thomas's blade finally found its mark, piercing Edmund's heart from behind while he was engaged with 3 other knights. As Edmund fell, his blood mixing with the cursed earth of Ravenshollow, he spoke his final words. "Death will not hold me. I shall return to finish what was begun." The ritual he had started was incomplete, his revenge unfulfilled. According to the dark magic he had studied, his soul would be trapped, neither alive nor dead, until justice was served. Thomas ordered Edmund's body to be buried in unconsecrated ground, far from any church, hoping to prevent his brother's spirit from finding rest. But this decision would prove to be his greatest mistake. For 7 years, Thomas ruled the Blackthorn lands with increasing paranoia and cruelty. Servants reported seeing Edmund's ghost walking the halls of the castle at night. Livestock died mysteriously, crops failed, and children in nearby villages began speaking of nightmares featuring a knight in black armor, whose face was nothing but shadow beneath his helm. But these were just the beginning. Edmund's spirit was growing stronger, feeding on the fear and suffering his brother's rule had created. The incomplete ritual that had bound him to unfinished business was slowly tearing a hole between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. On September 29, 1444, exactly 7 years after his death, Edmund Blackthorn returned to finish what he had started. But he didn't return as a typical ghost or specter. The dark magic he had wielded in life had twisted his death into something far more terrifying. Thomas had gathered an army to march against a neighboring lord who had refused to pay tribute. They were camped at Ravenshollow Field, the site of Edmund's death. When the impossible happened, at the stroke of midnight, witnesses saw a figure in black armor rise from the very ground where Edmund had fallen. But this wasn't a translucent specter or a skeletal wraith. This was Edmund Blackthorn, exactly as he had been in life, solid and real, and filled with 7 years of accumulated rage. His armor showed no signs of decay, his sword gleamed as brightly as ever, and his face beneath his helm was exactly as it had been the day he died. The truly horrifying part came at dawn. Thomas emerged from his tent to find his brother standing in the center of the camp, surrounded by 200 terrified soldiers who were afraid to approach the undead knight. Thomas, convinced this had to be some sort of trick or illusion, strode forward to confront what he believed was an imposter. That's when the witnesses saw something that defied all understanding. As Thomas approached, another figure began to materialize beside Edmund. At first, it appeared as a shadow, but gradually it took solid form. It was Thomas himself, identical in every detail, wearing the same armor, bearing the same weapons, even showing the same scars. The two Thomas Blackthorns stared at each other in mutual horror, each convinced the other was a demonic duplicate. Both began speaking at the same time, both claiming to be the real Thomas, both demanding that the soldiers arrest the imposter. Edmund watched this with what witnesses described as terrible amusement. The dark magic he had mastered in life had grown exponentially in death. He had learned to reach into a person's soul and create a perfect duplicate, complete with all their memories and experiences. Both Thomas Blackthorns were real. Both were the original, and both were filled with the absolute certainty that the other was a demonic fake. The psychological torture was exquisite. Edmund had given his brother the one thing that would drive him mad: doubt about his own identity. The two identical knights began to fight, each trying to prove his authenticity by killing his duplicate. The soldiers watched in paralyzed terror as their lord battled himself, neither able to gain an advantage because they possessed identical skills and knowledge. But Edmund wasn't finished. As the two Thomas Blackthorns fought, More figures began to emerge from the shadows. Every man that Edmund had killed in his lifetime appeared on the battlefield, not as vengeful spirits, but as perfect duplicates of their living selves. Soon, the field was filled with dozens of pairs of identical warriors, each fighting their own duplicate in desperate confusion. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Witnesses who survived would spend the rest of their lives in monasteries trying to find peace after seeing the impossible made manifest. The duplicates fought with the same skill as the originals, but they seemed to feel no pain, showed no fatigue, and worst of all, they seemed to enjoy the violence in a way their originals did not. As the sun reached its zenith, just as it had on the day of Edmund's death, the true horror reached its crescendo. Edmund began to duplicate himself, creating not just one copy, but dozens. The field filled with black-armored knights, all identical, all bearing the same weapons, all sharing the same terrible purpose. The original Thomas, driven mad by fighting his own duplicate for hours, finally managed to land a killing blow on his doppelganger. But as his duplicate fell, it began to laugh, and, with its dying breath, it spoke in Edmund's voice. "Now you know how it feels to kill yourself." That's when Thomas understood the true depth of his brother's revenge. Every duplicate he had been, fighting every man on the battlefield, they were all extensions of Edmund's will. His brother had turned the entire army against itself, forcing each man to battle his own reflection while Edmund watched from the shadows. The battle continued. For 3 days and nights, soldiers fled in terror, but they found the duplicates waiting for them wherever they ran. The dead piled upon the field, but for every original that fell, a duplicate would take its place, continuing the fight with mechanical precision. On the 4th day, only 2 figures remained standing on the field of Ravenshollow, Edmund Blackthorne and his brother Thomas. But Thomas was no longer entirely human. The 3 days of fighting his own duplicate had shattered his mind. He had begun to question whether he was the original Thomas or merely another of Edmund's creations. He spoke to himself constantly, arguing with voices only he could hear. Trying to convince himself of his own reality, Edmund approached his broken brother slowly, savoring every moment of his revenge. He had spent 7 years in the space between life and death planning this moment. He had learned to manipulate the very fabric of reality itself, turning his enemies' minds against them in ways far more cruel than simple murder. "Do you remember Father's last words?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying across the blood-soaked field. "He begged me to let him die. He said existence without certainty was worse than death. I didn't understand then, but you do now, don't you, brother?" Thomas raised his sword with trembling hands, no longer sure if the blade was real or just another manifestation of his tortured mind. "You're dead," he whispered. "I saw you die. I put the sword through your heart myself." "Yes," Edmund agreed. "You did, and I felt every moment of it. I felt the cold steel pierce my flesh. I felt my blood pour out onto this cursed ground. I felt my soul being torn from my body while I still lived. Do you know what that feels like, Thomas? To be aware of your own death while it happens." The final battle between the Blackthorne brothers was witnessed by only the crows and the dying men scattered across the field. It was not a duel of skill or strength, but a contest of wills. Edmund had become something beyond death itself, while Thomas had been driven beyond the boundaries of sanity. They fought for hours under the blazing sun. But the outcome was never in doubt. Edmund was no longer bound by the limitations of mortal flesh. He felt no fatigue, no pain, no doubt. Thomas, meanwhile, was fighting not just his brother, but his own fractured mind, seeing duplicates and shadows everywhere he looked. The end came when Thomas, exhausted and broken, finally asked the question Edmund had been waiting 7 years to hear. "What do you want from me?" Edmund's answer was simple. "I want you to live with what you've done. I want you to spend every remaining day of your life knowing that you destroyed your own family. I want you to question every reflection you see, every shadow that moves, every voice you hear. I want you to live in the same hell you created for me." With those words, Edmund Blackthorne simply faded away, like morning mist touched by sunlight. The curse was complete. He had his revenge, not through death, but through something far worse. The gift of absolute self-awareness without the mercy of death. Thomas Blackthorne survived the Battle of Raven's Hollow, but survival was perhaps the cruelest fate Edmund could have chosen for him. He spent the remaining 12 years of his life in a monastery, speaking to no one, staring at walls, terrified of his own reflection. The monks reported that he would often be found in his cell, arguing with empty air, pleading with someone they couldn't see to let him die. The field of Ravenshollow was declared cursed by the church. Grass would never grow there again. No animal would cross it. Even birds refused to fly over the space where the impossible battle had taken place. The village was abandoned within a month, and within a year. It was as if it had never existed at all. But the story doesn't end there. Records from monasteries across Europe tell of similar battles appearing throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Knights fighting identical duplicates of themselves. Armies turning against their own reflections. Entire battlefields, where the dead and living became indistinguishable. Some scholars believe that Edmund Blackthorne's ritual had torn a permanent hole in the fabric of reality itself. Others think his spirit, having tasted the power of absolute revenge, continued to manifest wherever hatred and betrayal created the right conditions. The most terrifying possibility is found in a manuscript I discovered in a sealed vault beneath the Vatican. Written in a mixture of Latin and a language that predates recorded history, it describes Edmund Blackthorne not as a vengeful spirit, but as something far worse. The first of a new kind of being, something that exists in the space between life and death, feeding on the doubt and self-hatred of the living. According to this document, Edmund didn't simply fade away after completing his revenge. He learned to move between the world of the living and the realm of the dead at will, appearing wherever someone is consumed by the same rage that once drove him. The manuscript claims he still walks among us today, drawn to those who harbor the darkest thoughts about their own family, their own identity, their own reality. The final entry in the manuscript is the most disturbing of all. Written in a hand different from the rest of the document, it reads, "I have seen him in dreams. The knight in black armor, whose face is shadow beneath his helm. He whispers that doubt is the gateway to truth, and truth is the gateway to madness. He asks me to look in the mirror and tell him which reflection is real. I fear I am beginning to see his point." The manuscript ends there, its author's fate unknown. But if you believe the stories, if you accept that some hatreds can transcend death itself, then Sir Edmund Blackthorne is still out there. Still fighting his war against the very concept of certainty. Still offering the gift of absolute self-awareness to those brave enough to look too deeply into their own reflection. They say that if you stare into a mirror at midnight and repeat his name 3 times, you might catch a glimpse of a knight in black armor standing behind you. But be warned, once you've seen Edmund Blackthorne, you'll never be completely sure which reflection is really you. The question that haunts me, the one that keeps me awake at night after 3 years of researching this story, is simple. In a world where every person questions their identity, their purpose, their very reality on a daily basis, how would we know if Edmund Blackthorne was already among us? How would we know if the doubt we feel about ourselves isn't his gift, slowly driving us toward the same madness that consumed his brother? Perhaps the most terrifying truth about the knight who fought his own ghost is that in the end, we all do. Every day, we battle the versions of ourselves we don't want to be. We fight against our own worst impulses. We struggle to prove to ourselves and others that we are who we claim to be. Edmund Blackthorne simply made that internal battle external, visible, and absolutely impossible to win. So the next time you catch yourself arguing with your own reflection, the next time you question whether you're really the person you think you are, remember the story of Sir Edmund Blackthorne. Remember that some battles are fought not on fields of honor, but in the dark corners of our own minds. And sometimes, the enemy staring back at us from the mirror isn't a reflection at all. It's the ghost of who we used to be, demanding to know why we let them die.